Thank you all so much for joining us this evening. So good evening. Thank you for joining us for our sample class at the Sharp School of Policy and Government on understanding human trafficking. I am Dylan. I am one of the assistant directors of graduate admissions here for the Sharp School of Policy and Government. I know tonight's topic is certainly intriguing, and I'm sure you all have plenty of great questions. And you should have the ability to send questions to both of us using the chat function or the Q&A function for tonight's event. But for me, it's my pleasure to introduce our professor this evening. So Dr. Louise Shelley is the Hearst Endowed Chair and a university professor here at the Shar School. So she founded and directs the Terrorism, Transnational Crime and Corruption Center, known as the TRAC Center. And she is a leading expert on the relationship among terrorism, organized crime and corruption, as well as human trafficking, transnational crime, and terrorism, with a particular focus on the former Soviet Union. She also specializes in illicit financial flows and money laundering, and she was also an inaugural Andrew Carnegie Fellow. And so with that, I will turn it over to you, Louise.
I'm delighted to meet so many of you prospective students, and I will tell you a little bit about what I teach and what I do at the Shar School. So tonight I'm talking to you about human trafficking, which is a course that I teach that's available to everybody in public policy, biodefense, security studies program. It serves just about every program that's in our master's field. And it is, how do I say, not an easy topic to talk about, but it addresses and has elements that affect everything that you are interested in, or I presume that you're interested in, because I have students who come who are interested in American justice, who are interested in international security issues, who've been in the military and seen human trafficking overseas. There are people who also come to this class who are interested in technology, because unfortunately, human traffickers are some of the most advanced users of technology. And then I have many students who are interested in conflict regions where human trafficking thrives. So there's something in this class for everybody. And I teach it from looking at what is going on in the United States, as well as what is going on internationally. About a decade ago, and I'm revising a book now that I wrote on that, I wrote on human trafficking, a global perspective. And one of the points that I made in this book is that human trafficking in the United States is different from that in other advanced, economically advanced, developed democratic societies. Because in the United States, the majority of the victims of human trafficking are our own citizens. In most other developed countries, the victims are brought from other countries, but that's not true. And even though there has been a lot of comment made on individuals who are now coming from Latin America and how they're going to be trafficked, the issue of human trafficking today, as it has been for a long time, is unfortunately a problem of American youth, meaning under 18 years of age, and many of them are minorities. So we're dealing with a problem that could not be much more relevant to the moment in which we're talking about Black Lives Matter, and how unfortunately the victims of human trafficking today, just as were the victims of slavery, Black in the past, today, unfortunately, a majority of those who are identified as victims of human trafficking are disproportionately Black. But this does not mean that this is the only type of human trafficking in the United States. We have many diverse types of human trafficking. We have individuals coming into the United States from Central America who are being trafficked by gangs. We have Asians were being trafficked into the United States who are working in massage parlors, as not every massage parlor is a center of human trafficking, but some of them do have human trafficking. There are human trafficking victims who are working in nail salons, agriculture, who have been brought from overseas. When we in the United States go off to prosecute and address this crime, most of the human trafficking that is prosecuted is related to sex trafficking. Although probably the majority of victims in the United States are those who are victims of labor trafficking, working in agriculture, construction, lawn maintenance businesses, nail salons, hotels, many, many different sectors of our economy in which there is a premium on cheap labor. And we also have in this Northern Virginia area individuals who are brought over by diplomats and employees of international financial institutions who keep domestic servants, and some of these are individuals who are trafficked. So these are sort of the diverse phenomena that we look at in trying to understand the phenomena. But human trafficking does not stand alone. It often converges with many other forms of illicit activity. You may not realize, but 1/3 of the fish that you go to the supermarket and you buy and it says that it is wild caught is illegally obtained fish. How is that relevant to human trafficking? Well, what we find in the illicit world is that one form of illegal activity goes along with another, so that most of the people who are employed on these fishing vessels that are illegally fishing are using trafficked labor, who are working without passports, often without pay, in often brutal conditions. And why are there so many people recruited for this? It keeps prices low. And if the fishing boat is caught, they can abandon it because they don't care about their workers on this boat. So that's the tragedy of human trafficking. It is related to so many other issues, including, as I talk about in some of my classes, it is also related to terrorism, as we've seen with Boko Haram and ISIS, that have used trafficked women sometimes as a revenue source and sometimes as a reward for foreign fighters. In this country, we have an enormous merger of the problem of human trafficking and the problem of drugs. Years ago, and we have wonderful and interesting students that come to George Mason. They work, many of them, who maybe like you in the audience, are working part-time and studying part-time. And one of my students worked in the White House office on drugs. And in the early winter is Human Trafficking Month. And I was asked to come and talk to the White House office on drugs for their required lecture on human trafficking. And I talked about this relationship of human trafficking and drugs. And they just didn't believe it, or why should we think about this issue when we're focusing on drugs? Now, today, I'm working and finishing up a National Science Foundation project in which we're looking at the case files that have been prosecuted of human trafficking in the United States. So if you come to George Mason and you're interested in these issues, there are possibilities to work at TRAC and at our Anti-Illicit Trade Institute, because we're raising money through doing online education that provides money for jobs and research positions. And one of the things we're doing is looking at the cases that have been prosecuted, and we're finding that there is an enormous convergence in the use of drugs and the controls that are maintained over human trafficking victims by forcing drugs on them. And that is going on even during the pandemic, as pimps are trying to recruit their future victims online and providing them drugs and trying to get them hooked so they become dependent on these human traffickers. So we need to think not in silos, but how this phenomenon intersects with many other different areas of activity. Some of you may be interested in technology, and George Mason is doing a lot in the technology space. And that's unfortunately one of the areas in which human traffickers excel. A few years ago, DARPA, which is one of the research arms of the Department of Defense, decided to do a major research project on human trafficking. In fact, one of our students who entered last year into our master's program had worked at DARPA on this project, having been a specialist on human trafficking and having worked on the human trafficking hotline. So what this DARPA project found was that in a relatively short number of years, by examining the websites that were used to advertise human trafficking, that we saw about $250,000 was spent on human trafficking ads in a relatively short period of time, in a few years. This tells you how lucrative this business is. And there were over 60 million advertisements for individuals selling sex. Most of them, we believe, are victims of human trafficking. And that project is now finished, but the database is going on and being used by prosecutors across the United States to go after the problem. If you go into this research on human trafficking, you find that the new technology has just been an enormous boom for human traffickers. It's not just online websites, though those are enormously used, but also social media is a way of both recruiting new victims and selling their services. To give you an idea of the scale and coordination of this activity, there was a case prosecuted in which a group of traffickers were indicted, and they were operating massage parlors where they were advertising for sexual services in over 50 cities in the United States, Canada, and Australia. And all of this activity was coordinated by one individual who had operative cells operating in these different cities, and they recruited victims in China and brought them to the United States for exploitation. So when you think about how much human trafficking has moved into the area of technology, it is hardly surprising that during the pandemic, human trafficking has grown at just an enormous rate, because individuals are online, young girls are out of school, out of supervision, and using social media, using their computers more than ever. And the traffickers are out searching for future victims and connecting online. One of the greatest problems, and this is really tragic, is the enormous growth of commercial sex exploitation, of child sex exploitation online during the pandemic that has grown multiple times as individuals have been recruited to perform sex acts on camera. And this is then being sold by traffickers, not only in the United States, but internationally. So this is just one element of how technology is facilitating a growth of a phenomenon that you might think of that needs personal interactions. But unfortunately, it is amazing how the online world can promote the growth of this activity. What else is going on in the pandemic? Unfortunately, victims of human trafficking or survivors who've left often go to support services, to houses or residential facilities that try and protect them and provide services. But in the crisis that we've had in the pandemic, many of these service facilities and service providers have shut down, making individuals who are trying to leave this difficult past in a situation without support services. So that is especially hard at the present time. When we think about how this phenomenon exists, I've been talking to you about technology, and that's a key part of this, but it's not the only part. And one of the things that you need to think about is how this phenomenon that seems so illicit and maybe so far from you intersects with the legitimate economy. So it certainly intersects with legal social media that is not adequately screening the messages that are sent through its social messaging apps. It's going on online. And where do you think that many of the victims of human trafficking are exploited? One of the things that we're doing now is we're working on an NSF project, that's the National Science Foundation, on what does an illicit supply chain for human trafficking look like? And if you were listening to the news, you might think that there are people coming across the border and they're caught into these nets, and that's how human trafficking is going on. But in truth, much of it is recruitment of youth in the United States who run away from home, who are in foster care, who have run away from home multiple times, who become increasingly vulnerable. And these are the individuals who are exploited by these very sophisticated traffickers who know how to manipulate their victims. But you may think of it as a phenomenon that does not intersect with the legitimate economy other than the tech world. But one of the things that we're analyzing now is where does the victim of human trafficking meet their trafficker? And the Human Trafficking Institute, that's been following US federal cases, finds that 80% in the last 3 years of human trafficking victims are exploited in hotels. Something that most people don't think about, of how this is going on within the legitimate economy. And we are now sitting and looking at cases dating back to 15 years to see how long this has been a problem. But it has been very much ignored. Hotels didn't establish policies, they didn't train people, and unfortunately, sometimes their staff were complicit in this human trafficking, even when the victims have been physically harmed. So there are now many legal suits that have been filed against hotel chains by victims. And this is a new way of using the law to promote financial resources for victims who have been exploited for years without any forms of compensation. But it's also an effort to force the legitimate economy to be responsible for the type of illicit and very harmful behavior that it is facilitating. So I think this is very important to think about and understand. And it's amazing how few people have written on this. There's just no articles in the United States on how this human trafficking intersects with with hospitality industry and on what an enormous scale that it intersects. So this is part of where research is important and helps illuminate and understand the phenomenon of where we need to go as policymakers to address it, what kind of role do corporations play, and what kind of policies they need to assume in order to be better actors in this economy and not be part of and facilitators of criminal activity. These are some of the questions that we raise in class and address. And one of the ways I teach my class is to have an enormous range of speakers who work and have worked on this issue both in the United States and internationally. So last semester when I taught this class, I had a wonderful Black woman lawyer who works for Rights for Girls, who follows how young Black girls are often going to prison and jail, and there the traffickers are working on recruiting them while in jail and when they come out and don't have a means of legitimate survival. And that's one of the world activities that Rights for Girls focuses on. I also had a very distinguished writer who did a major article for National Geographic looking at human trafficking in Northeast India and Nepal. And he came and talked to the class about his recent research and what he did to research an article, how he decided to write about it, to reach a large popular audience that is reading the National Geographic. And then another speaker I had was a former student of mine who went on to be the deputy director of counter-human trafficking for the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which is a 40-country organization that has one of the largest staff of any multinational organization working against human trafficking. And because of Zoom, she was able to join us from Vienna and persisted in lecturing, even though she was surrounded by sirens while there was a terrorist attack going on in Vienna that night. So these are just some of the people that we have and distinguished lecturers that come and that students have the ability to interact with, ask questions, and help stimulate their thinking and their analysis. And the students in my classes, like many of you who are here tonight, I'm sure, have had personal experiences that have awakened them to these problems and want to think about how you can address them in many different ways of using policy. So I've said enough. There are 30 of you in the audience, and I hope that you'll ask some questions.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Louise. And like I said, you have a few different opportunities to ask questions. And so you can either use the chat box and you can reply to all panelists and attendees, or you can ask a question in the question and answer section. And as a MPP student myself, I'll try to get the questions rolling for you. I know that with technology advancing and progressing as quickly as it has, how do you see the relationship between technology and human trafficking evolving over time?
I think that technology has facilitated an enormous growth in human trafficking, both in person, because of the ability that it provides for anonymity, for people to connect rapidly, impersonally, and that's important. But what we've seen is that technology has just been on steroids during the pandemic. And I was listening to a lecture by the head of the IMF about 2 weeks ago. And she talked for a long time about what's going on with the economy. And then after about an hour, she said, yes, there's a really serious problem that the criminal world has had an absolute heyday during the pandemic, and it has just grown. The criminal activity online has just grown enormously. And unfortunately, human trafficking was out ahead in this area before, and it hasn't really diminished. One of the things I often testify before Congress, and did so about a month ago on the issue of human trafficking. So Congress decided there's a law that in commercial code that requires that exempts platforms for being responsible for what they host. And that was changed a couple of years ago with the passage of a law called FOSTA SESTA. So for a while, there were massive amounts of sex trafficking ads on Craigslist that was closed down, Backpage that was closed down. And after this law was passed, for a few months, you saw that there was a decline in the number of advertisements for sex trafficking in the United States. And now they've shifted overseas. So traffickers are placing ads in websites that are hosted in the Netherlands, and this problem continues. So it's not as if without consistent policies internationally, technology has just been a facilitator of growth.
Yeah, and that's absolutely fascinating. And so we got a question in the Q&A saying, you mentioned Boko Haram's use of human trafficking as a revenue source and as a reward for foreign fighters. Are other VEOs in the Sahel involved in human trafficking? If so, how, and what can the US do to fight it?
Well, this is very, very interesting, because one of the speakers that I had in my class on human trafficking was somebody who worked in the intelligence community, and in an earlier job, now he was working on drugs, but earlier he was stationed to work in Africa. And he described how a few days after the Chibok girls were kidnapped by Boko Haram, he went up with the Nigerian military to try and rescue them when they were still all as a group. And he described how, because of the massive corruption in the Nigerian military, the military was reluctant and refused to intervene and rescue the girls because they had no proper body armor, they didn't have arms that they needed. And so the US was there to help, but in the face of this massive corruption, there was nothing that they could do. So they managed to use whatever their intercepts or whatever to find the girls, but the girls were not rescued. And so Boko Haram is a very famous case of what is going on, but there is a lot of human trafficking that is going on from Nigeria north through the Sahel up to North Africa. And then many of these individuals are trying to cross into Europe. Both men, more of them are men, but they're also women, they're children, and many of them are trafficked along the way. And in my class on human trafficking, I assign readings done by a very vibrant group called the Global Initiative on Transnational Organized Crime that was started by a group of specialists out of Africa and has a lot of fascinating research on this, and was able to document who is involved. But there's not such direct terrorism involvement in Africa outside of Boko Haram. I should also mention, for those of you who are interested, that one of the things that TRAC does, that's the research center that I head, is we have a contract. We're just finishing our 3rd out of 5 years for preparing the terrorism database that comprises the statistical annex of the US State Department. So very shortly, the State Department is going to be releasing its country reports on terrorism. And as part of this report, there is reports in basically language and text from each of the countries. And then there's a statistical analysis that looks at trends. And so we have approximately 20 students that we employ at TRAC to enter data for the database. And some of them, one of them who's who's graduating next semester, or this semester, I should say, has just joined us to work for a while on our NSF project. But this is another opportunity that you have, and then people who, if you apply, if you have skills, we have a really dynamic and fascinating team that participates, and they read newspaper articles and try and understand this. And we have lectures for them on a bi-weekly basis. So it's an interesting dynamic part of what we're doing at the Shar School.
And that segues excellently into the next question. So Lawrence mentioned that for someone who's interested in countering human trafficking and possibly getting a degree from the Shar School, what skills or experiences should we get before transitioning into this field, this profession?
I think there's so many different ways of approaching it. I have students who've worked in the military, who've worked in civil society on this, who work in Department of Homeland Security on migration and even Homeland Security investigations. So I wouldn't say that there's one path to work on this, but one of the things that is unique about George Mason and the Shar School is that we are basically the only program in the United States with such extensive coverage of everything that you need to understand the illicit economy, transnational crime, terrorism, money laundering, all of these things that you need to be able to function in the job world, because this is such a multi-dimensional phenomenon. There's not one answer of how to address this problem, but we can give you the skill sets that you need to do it.
Absolutely. And so another question that we have in a little bit of a different direction is, how do you see social media playing a role in combating human trafficking, especially trafficking in persons? Conversely, is there any research regarding the intersections of social media, recruitment, and exploitation?
There is. And one of the things that if you take this human trafficking class, we do pay attention to social media and the role that technology plays in recruitment. So I think that that's very important. And one of the things that we also look at is the role of cryptocurrencies and what role they're playing in human trafficking. So it's not just social media, it's all kinds of technology that are involved.
And we have a student joining us from Bangkok, Thailand, and they are interested is there is any cooperation or joint effort in countering trafficking efforts between governments in Southeast Asia.
At the moment, there isn't, but about 5 years ago, we had a specialist, a prosecutor from the Thai government who spent several months at TRAC working and learning about human trafficking.
Awesome. So we got another question from Margaret saying, is there a strong correlation between human trafficking and the country's GDP per capita, or is it essentially equally prevalent across the globe? And is one of the best ways to fight against human trafficking to get that population above the poverty level?
There's certainly a correlation between poverty and human trafficking. And one of the problems that we're seeing now in the pandemic is that as so many individuals are declining in their income levels and forced into really difficult situations, many of them are vulnerable to labor trafficking and sex trafficking. Somebody that I know who runs a wonderful NGO in India has been raising money to feed, 1 million meals to women and their families who are trafficked in India, who, because of the raging pandemic, have not been working and haven't had a way to be financially supported. So there are just, many ways that this phenomenon is affecting individuals, and many individuals are on the move as they cannot survive in the environment that they're living in. But the fact that we have so much human trafficking in the United States is evidence that it's not just the affluence of a country that prevents human trafficking. We have plenty of human trafficking in this country, and much of it is related to the enormous economic disparity we have in this country. But there are also serious problems in wealthy countries in the Middle East that have basically trafficked labor who are engaged in large-scale construction there. So affluence is not the sole solution, though it certainly increases vulnerability.
And the next question is a little bit tied into recent events. They ask, with the United States leaving Afghanistan later this year, do you think that there's going to be an effect on trafficking there? And a kind of separate question, in general, who do you think the most vulnerable group in the United States is, and what are the loopholes that make them the most vulnerable population?
One of them the most vulnerable population in the United States in relation to their numbers is Black youth. And then I think disproportionately Hispanic youth. We do not have great data on this, but we are still suffering from the long time legacy of slavery, and that very much affects our patterns of human trafficking. And this is why the United States is distinctive from other democratic industrialized countries, and that we have so many of our own youth who are victims of sexual exploitation. One of the things that I do in my classes is I try and keep things very much alive with recent webinars, podcasts, different ways of learning. And that's been particularly prevalent in the Zoom era, but even before Zoom. And so one of the assignments that I gave my students was one of the alternatives was listening to a podcast that was mapping where there had been slavery and where there was a lot of human trafficking, and listening to this podcast and then critiquing it and did it make sense.
And to your mention earlier on how you frequently interact with Capitol Hill, what type of difficulties, if any, did you find in bridging the gap between human trafficking and national security, especially in speaking to Congress and the intelligence community?
How would I say? You know, we live in an extremely polarized country. But fortunately, I would say that the issue of human trafficking is one in which both parties are very willing to work together. And so it is not usually a very contentious issue. Though I'll say that when I testified about a month ago before the House Financial Services Committee, I had all kinds of concrete recommendations on what could be done by our financial system to cut off the money and the profits from human trafficking. And there were some serious questions on that. And then there was a lot of political discussion on what's going on the southern border, as if that's the major element of human trafficking in the United States. So this is the first time that I've seen such a political division, but the hearing that I testified in was brought together by both the Republican and the Democratic staff in the House Financial Services Committee. They interviewed 50 people, and I could not tell you who had been chosen by the Republicans and who had been chosen by the Democrats. I mean, they just chose highly professional people together that complemented each other. It looked more like some of the key staff members chose people from their states that they knew, rather than that there was a political element to it. But there was some very, very interesting discussions of online sexual exploitation and what is not being done enough to deal with child sexual exploitation online and how it's continuing. So, you know, this issue of our population and their vulnerability and their exploitation is critical to national security, but also the linkages between terrorism and transnational crime, including human trafficking, is one element, but also transnational crime that is deeply involved in this issue in many parts of the world is also a national security issue. So it's not very hard to tie it into it.
You got into this a little bit at the end of your answer, but how do you propose we deal with the demand side of human trafficking, where there is a common perception that issues connected to human trafficking like sex trafficking and prostitution, or the idea of employing illegal workers are considered a victimless crime?
I haven't had many people think of it as a victimless crime. Though I'll tell you one story of why I love teaching at the Shar School and not at some, how do I say, snooty Ivy League institution. So at Harvard, there is a core course that fills many of your general requirements, course requirements on human trafficking. And the class is being taught there by one of the leading Black intellectuals of the United States, who's a sociologist at Harvard. And so early in the trajectory of this course, I was invited up to lecture because they used and they still use my book as the core book in the class. And so I was expecting with these brilliant students some wonderful question. And the first question I get asked, and the student was not trying to bait me. He said, "What is wrong with human trafficking? It keeps us competitive in a global environment." Yes, you're making a face. And this professor said to me, "You know, this is the problem of teaching at Harvard. I have one student here whose mother was a slave. And I have this student here who seems to think that even though the international community has signed a covenant saying that human trafficking is outlawed, somebody thinks that this is okay because it keeps us competitive in a global economy." So that's one of the problems of why this phenomenon still exists and is a problem, because there are many people, even, getting the best, coming from great privilege and getting the best education, that still don't think about this as being wrong. And there's certainly many people who are taking advantage of individuals who are vulnerable. So part of it is increasing education. There is certainly much more awareness. There are many TV shows, there are many films that raise awareness, and there's much social activism on this. A few weeks ago, I gave a talk to deans of nursing schools because unfortunately, there is so much violence used against victims of human trafficking that many of them pass through hospitals and emergency rooms, and what they need to do to train future nurses to recognize this phenomenon, which is often, the victim is brought in and they said, "Oh, they have an accident." Well, nothing looks like an accident, but they don't know what to look for in these signs. So it requires a very broad background and training to do this work. I see a question from someone in the chat boxes. Can anyone from the performing arts profession transition into this field? I mean, one of the wonders of a public policy education is that you don't need a particular background to enter this field. People come with every life experience. And since some of the best work that's being done to help people overcome the trauma of human trafficking is through the arts, someone who has a background in performing arts may certainly find a place for themselves to work and be part of this community. So that's what I love teaching our students, is they come from incredibly diverse backgrounds.
Yeah, and to that point, we offer a wide variety of career development resources to help students make pivots in their careers into new fields. And one of the wonderful things about the Shar School, in my opinion, is that because our students are coming from every academic and professional background, you have literally a endless amount of opportunities to burgeon into those fields that excite you the most. And the best piece of advice I always give to new and incoming students is don't be shy. We have professors that love talking to our students. We have some wonderful faculty and staff that want to help you take advantage of absolutely everything that the school has to offer. Um, and we got another question for you. It's more about when you teach your human trafficking graduate course. Do you teach it in the fall? Do you teach it in the spring? When do you do that?
I teach it on rotation. So the next time I'm teaching it is next year, next spring.
Wonderful. And it looks like we have another question in the Q&A. They say, how has legislation regarding human trafficking and efforts to counter human trafficking evolved in foreign states? And are other nations similarly invested in the issues of human trafficking and the convergence of other forms of illicit activity?
There's just no, let's take, for example, Western Europe. So there is no consistency in the way countries are fighting this phenomenon. They may be very interested in fighting it, but they'll do it in totally different ways. For example, there's the Swedish model that makes buying sex illegal. All right, so this is a prohibition model. And then there is the Dutch model, in which making the whole keeping of a brothel, it's legal to run a brothel. It's a registered business, and an individual who works in that business is an employee who gets health checks, gets pension, gets the same benefits that somebody else has who's employed in another sector. But there's one problem with this. Well, there's more than one problem. But the main problem is that there's more demand, especially because the Netherlands has the largest port in Europe, and so sailors come into Rotterdam. Then they also come to Amsterdam, and there are not enough people with EU working permits who can legally work in this sector. So because it is legal for people who can work legally, but there are not enough legal workers. And so there's a whole underground illicit economy of individuals who are trafficked from Africa, from Asia, to satisfy the demand. And those individuals are very, often very seriously exploited. And about a year and a half ago, TRAC had an intern from the Netherlands who was a lawyer who worked as a volunteer in one of these legal clinics trying to help victims. So that's two societies with very well developed legal systems that have alternative ways to deal with the problem, and neither of them is working that well, I hate to say.
And we have another question for you. They ask, is Interpol or some other UN or international investigative agency involved in counter trafficking?
Absolutely. So the UN has the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, and they have people in there working on human trafficking. There's the IOM, the International Organization of Migration, that has people working on human trafficking. And I've had at least one former student who's worked there. We have the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, that works against human trafficking. They don't have investigative capacity, but they do a lot of training and trying to build capacity to address it. Then that's the person who helped run this was one of my speakers. Then last semester, and my former student. Then there's the Europol that has a large number of people working on against human trafficking and human smuggling and doing data analysis of where the phenomenon is, how it operates, and we read some of that in my class.
Excellent. Well, I do not see any more questions. And so if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. Oh, looks like we just got one. Um, so they ask, since the 1950s, the Chinese government has used forced labor to fill some of their labor needs while punishing political views and activities unacceptable to that regime, according to declassified U.S. intelligence. Would you propose banning certain products produced with forced labor in China?
This is a very complex issue, but the House Financial Services Committee, on which I was saying I was testifying, also has legislation just on this issue of what to do with addressing the financial flows connected to forced labor in the Uyghur populations in Western China. So, but the problem is massive. When you think about this, the 85% of the cotton that's produced in China comes from this region. And think of how many products that we import into the United States have elements of cotton that are produced by these individuals who are basically trafficked and enforced labor. So there are very, very complex and difficult issues of how do you stop a phenomenon that is so pervasive and yet so linked to the supply chain of so many products that are coming into the United States.
And it looks like we have time for just one more question. So this attendee is viewing us from Brazil, and they say they're aware that human trafficking is very common in their country, but is the U.S. government cooperating with Brazil in any way to help tackle this issue?
In the past, there's always been, some cooperation. Just before COVID started, a year ago, September, I was at a conference in Brazil that dealt with some of these issues of illicit trade, and there were many American officials who were who are assigned to the embassy who are working on some of these problems, who are engaging with their Brazilian colleagues. But one of the greatest problems is that the illegal timber trade, the problems that are going on in the Amazon, are often involving individuals who are being placed in forced labor. These are going on in remote parts of Brazil, in which the US doesn't have a presence. And part of the understanding and the need to do something about this is to understand the illicit timber trade and how it is linked to forced labor, and try and stop that timber entering into our economy and monitoring the flows of it. One of the things that we've done at TRAC is we have a project, and we did an event a few months ago on the illicit timber trade, focusing on the Amazon.
Well, thank you everyone for your wonderful questions, and thank you, Dr. Shelley, for joining us tonight. We're very much appreciative. And if you are interested in learning a little bit more about what the SHAR School can do for future education in terms of professional development and future academic opportunities, I would highly encourage you getting in contact with us. So I left Dr. Shelley's email information in there in case you have a few follow-up questions you'd like to ask. But you're also more than encouraged to set up a one-on-one appointment with either myself or any of us in the graduate admissions team by sending us an email at shar@gmu.edu. And I also left a little bit of information about how to apply to our programs. But thank you all so much for joining us tonight. I hope you enjoy the rest of your evenings, and thank you so much again.
Thank you for being such an interesting audience. I hope I meet some of you in my future classes. Good night.